Well, training at altitude, the way that it differs is at higher altitudes you've got less oxygen available. So obviously, being an athlete, it's where you're running and conditioning, and you are using your lungs and trying to conditioning your lungs basically to accommodate the high altitude.
It's based off a positive pressure system. So when you're at a higher elevation, you're going to you have less barometric pressure, so your ability to get oxygen from your lungs into your blood and distributed to your tissues is not as high as it would be at lower elevations.
Training at altitude, although there's not a high concentration of oxygen, is beneficial because when you train at this level, your body becomes more efficient dealing with oxygen at the lower sea levels. We're able to process the oxygen better up here because there isn't as much. When we go down to sea level, there's a higher concentration of oxygen that our body can then use more effectively at that level.
And really it comes into play with aerobic activities, distance type activities. Anaerobic activities aren't really affected at high elevation training. So your highly aerobic activities, when you're using oxygen, are going to be the times where high altitude is really an advantage. When you get to high altitude, your ability to carry oxygen around in your system and deliver it to your tissues is diminished, so you're going to be more fatigued. So having your athletes, having an acclimation period for your athletes is very important, because those changes or those physiological changes that occur to when you're at high elevation don't occur immediately, and they occur over time. So long-term physiological changes take time, and they're different for everybody. So some people may adapt quicker than others at high elevation.
Yeah.
The intermediate stage takes place over the first several days. Respiratory and heart rates speed up, and faster breathing rate changes acid-base balance.
The long-term process occurs within a few weeks. It decreases the maximum heart rate, increases the number of RBCs. Excretion of base occurs via the kidneys to restore acid-base balance. Chemical changes within RBCs that make them more efficient at unloading oxygen to the tissues. It increases the number of mitochondria and oxidative enzymes.
Even distance runners, what will happen is they'll come up to high altitude and they'll train for that oxygen. Because of the oxygen deficiency, they'll come up to altitude, they'll train, develop those red blood cells, and then go run like a competition or a marathon, because now they've got more available oxygen in their body.
Yes, I certainly feel a difference training at a higher altitude, especially me coming from Sedona, which is about 4,500 feet, and training up here, which is about 7,000. I certainly feel a difference, because the altitude, you get used to training with less oxygen, and when you go down at lower elevation, you can draw in a lot more oxygen. And a guy I was on my high school track team, his name's Jesus Rivera. He's on the ASU track team, he runs 800, and he certainly feels different from training down at ASU and then coming up here. He's come to a couple meets up here. Like he's amazed of how different it is, how much different it is. And me being a 400 hurdler, training up here, I mean, I can run for days, I feel like, at lower elevation, especially at sea level. It's quite extraordinary.
Training at high elevation, you kind of feel better than people who train at lower, because like when you're in a race, like 400 hurdles for instance, you feel like when other people are getting tired, you feel you have more to go, even though like it's the same amount of distance, but you feel better because you're not at elevation. And when you train up here and then you go down, you just feel better, because it's just easier. You can breathe more. You just feel better. Yeah.
I see a lot of changes in the athletes from their transition from altitude to sea level, and the biggest one is probably in the race, halfway through a longer race, when typically a runner would start getting fatigued. They don't. The athletes that come down from altitude, that's actually when they start doing better. So a lot of times you'll find the athletes maybe will go out slightly slower in a race, but overall they'll do a lot better, because the second half of the race, when everyone else is getting fatigued, they're actually feeling better and picking up the pace. So they're able to finish races a lot harder than they normally would have, and usually feel good throughout the race, more so than if they were just training at sea level.
exercising at altitude, especially with someone with sickle cell, is that sickle cell trait is when your red blood cells are shaped like sickles, like crescent moons, and they are typically stickier than your normal red blood cell. When you're exercising at altitude, A, you can't get enough oxygen because of the shape of the cell, and B, those sticky cells tend to clump together and clog the circulation pathways, which can then lead to fainting, passing out. It can even become fatal if they're not getting enough circulation where they need to.
So the problem is we already have less oxygen available at higher altitudes. So, you know, if there's an athlete who's just not giving their body enough time to recover, what will happen is if they do have sickle cell, sometimes they can start having a sickle cell attack where their cells will start to sickle. They'll have won't be able to transport oxygen in their body. Becomes dangerous, obviously, with no oxygen in the body to your organs or your brain or anything like that. It becomes difficult. Sickle cell is most commonly found in African Americans. Every athlete that is African American descent is tested for sickle cell because it is most predominantly found in there. Male, female, it doesn't matter. It's not really found more in one or the other. It's more so being.
Yes, I have had experiences with athletes in sickle cell. When I was at Utah State University, we had a couple athletes who were sickle cell positive, and we're not quite the elevation that we are here, but we are still high elevation above 5,000 feet, so that does present certain issues for athletes who are sickle cell positive, which can lead to life-threatening or emergent situations with those athletes that need to be handled appropriately.
I've had one incident last year where we had a football athlete who got in trouble with the coach and was conditioning, and the coach ran him without hardly any rest, and he basically started to have a sickle cell attack where he basically just started to cramp up. He started hyperventilating because he was getting scared about his sickle cell attack because he knew he had sickle cell. And what we did was, your immediate treatment for that was, immediately get oxygen out of him.
So the biggest thing is number one, knowing which athletes are sickle cell positive and who are at risk for having a sickling type event that could lead to something like ischemic rhabdomyolysis. So the biggest thing is recognizing, knowing what their workouts are going to be, how much they're going to be exerting themselves. A lot of times the high intensity, heavy interval training may be an issue for them. So knowing when those days are going to be, and maybe being aware enough to have them back out if they do start to have things like low back pain and cramping, or cramping in their lower extremities, things like that. And just always being aware and letting them know the risks that they're at by being sickle cell positive and training at high elevation. So that's the biggest thing that you can do is always being aware of your athletes and when they may need to be pulled out of something before they do, before a sickling event occurs. Because
the cells do sickle, and then that oxygen transport is less, basically, you want to get as much available oxygen in the system as possible. So oxygen tank where you're getting 100% oxygen saturation is basically the immediate treatment for sickle cell. You would do that, and they usually typically recover from that. That athlete did. You'd still call 911 and send them to, because you don't know if they will come out of that or will not. So you apply the oxygen immediately. Call 911 and send them to urgent care. Some people think like higher altitude affects asthma or makes it worse, and in most cases there's actually research now that shows that it's really not the case. If you're on high altitude with asthma, it's only if they have an asthma attack or severe asthma that the altitude becomes a problem, because there's less oxygen available, but the altitude itself won't make your asthma worse typically. It's not really the altitude, it's more so they found that it's the cool, dry air that creates the problem for asthma.